Today's event is entitled Women's Equality at Home and Abroad. Our featured speaker, Anne Hoiberg, is president of the Women's Museum of California at Liberty Station and the founder of the Anne Hoiberg Women's Center at the Women's Museum of California. This offers speakers bureau, walking tours, community partnerships with women's organizations for meetings and gatherings, and many informative events. Oh, I just remembered, it's not in Liberty Station anymore. This was a bio that I wrote for Anne when we did an event last fall, but it has since moved to Balboa Park. For 24 years, she has been a member of a San Diego delegation at the annual meeting of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Anne was a research psychologist at the Naval Health Research Center in Point Loma for 25 years. In recognition of her work, Anne was appointed an election supervisor for the US Department of State and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe during elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Belarus, and Ukraine between 1997 and 2004. She was initially recruited to the League of Women Voters San Diego as International Relations Committee Chair back in the late 1990s. She went on to serve as co-president with Norma Damachek in 2008 and with Susan Baer in 2010. Today, she serves on our board of directors again as International Relations Chair. We'll also hear an update on CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, from a league leader who is spearheading our CEDAW efforts, Rosemary Straley. But now I'd like to present Anne Hoiberg.
Thank you, Kim. It's wonderful to be with all of you, and I'm just thrilled to be able to talk about the United Nations and the Commission on the Status of Women. So I will be talking very briefly about the United Nations, and then I will segue into talking about the Commission on the Status of Women. I'm going to concentrate quite a bit on the Fourth World Conference on Women, which was held in 1995. And I'll talk about the 25th anniversary, which was last year. And then we'll wind up by talking about CSW 65, which was held this year in March for 2 weeks. And it was CSW 65, the 65th anniversary of the Commission on the Status of Women. So if we could open up the slideshow, we'll begin my presentation. And Jean, you can go ahead and put on the first slide. As you can see, the United Nations was founded and is located in New York City. Back in 1945, delegates from 50 countries met for 3 months in San Francisco to establish the United Nations and to create the Charter of the United Nations. And what's fascinating to me is that Alice Paul, the suffragist from the early 1900s, insisted that the equal rights of men and women had to be included in the Charter of the United Nations, and it is. And she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. And we're going to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of that amendment. At the convention in San Francisco, as I said, there were delegates from 50 countries. 4 of those delegates, official delegates, were women. And one of those, Virginia Gildersleeve, represented the United States. So next slide. Now, the United Nations is made up of 6 principal organs. Of course, the General Assembly has 193 members representing each of the 193 countries of the United Nations. The Security Council deals with issues primarily related to peace and stability throughout the world. The Economic and Social Council is the primary council that deals with specialized commissions, such as the Commission on the Status of Women. The Secretariat is that beautiful tall building, 39 stories in New York City, and deals with all of the logistical aspects of the United Nations, including peacekeeping operations. And at The Hague in the Netherlands, we have the International Court of Justice, and that deals with disputes between countries. For example, Mexico took the United States to the International Court of Justice because we were sentencing Mexican nationals to be executed, and Mexico does not have the death penalty in its constitution. So the United States was told to not execute these Mexican nationals. And finally, there is the Trusteeship Council, which was created to help countries becoming independent. It's pretty much out of commission at the moment. Next slide, Jean. Okay, and as you can see here, the United Nations system is incredibly comprehensive. As you can see, there are programs, there are commissions. It's just amazing, all of the endeavors of the United Nations. And as you can see, there's the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization, the World Bank Group. So it covers all aspects of life for all peoples of the world. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned, the Economic and Social Council is the council that really coordinates the work of 14 UN specialized agencies, 9 functional commissions, such as the Commission on the Status of Women, and 5 regional commissions. And it receives reports from 9 UN funds and programs and issues policy recommendations to the UN system and to member states. Now, ECOSOC really encouraged non-governmental organizations to apply for consultative status. The Economic and Social Council really wants civil society to be involved in the work of the United Nations. So I applied through the United Nations Association here in San Diego so that UNA here could have consultative status with the UN. And that would enable us as members, as delegates, to attend events at the United Nations. And so it's been an absolute pleasure for me to be able to attend events back at the United Nations. And I unfortunately wasn't able to attend last year's CSW nor this year's CSW, primarily because they were canceled. Anyway, so we do have the Commission on the Status of Women, and its principal global, it is the principal global intergovernmental body exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. The CSW promotes women's rights, documents the reality of women's lives, and shapes global standards on gender equality and the empowerment of women. So it covers all issues related to women's equality and the empowerment of women. Next slide. Now, after the CSW came into being, it was determined that we really need to set up certain standards and conventions. And so to begin with, Eleanor Roosevelt was the chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights, and she was tasked with creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the beauty of the UDHR is that it does not roll women into the all-consuming men. So Eleanor Roosevelt insisted that it would start out by talking about all human beings. And then throughout this UDHR, it starts each article either with everyone or no one. So everyone has a right to a nationality, and no one shall be held in slavery. So this is how clever it was to make sure that all human beings are included. Now, what I think is fascinating under Article 16, which deals with marriage, it also states that everyone has a right to marry and to found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution. Marriage shall be entered into only with free and full consent of the intending spouses. So here again, it's very clear that no distinction is made between men and women. And I think this is the beauty of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, another issue that was so important to the Commission on the Status of Women was the issue of pay equity. And pay equity, as you know, is a continuing problem for women throughout the world. Well, in 1951, the International Labor Organization and CSW worked together and created the Convention of Equal Remuneration for Men and Women Workers for Work of Equal Value. 1951. Now, this was a standard for legislation to be created by all member states of the UN. And here in the United States, Edith Green from Oregon created the Equal Pay Act of 1963. It took her 8 years to get that enacted, but we have that here in the US. Of course, we're still working on the Equal Paycheck Act that we hope will be passed. Another important convention, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, was put out to member states to sign on to this convention, CEDAW, and to ratify it. It has been ratified by 189 countries. Only 4 countries have not ratified it, and the United States, unfortunately, is one of those 4. Okay, so we'll move on, and I'll just talk briefly about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is another convention that has not been ratified by the United States. In fact, we're the only country in the world that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, another important document created by the United Nations is the Declaration on Violence Against Women. And this came out in 1993. And this defines all forms of violence against women. And this is the standard on which all member states are encouraged to create their own legislation to end violence against women. And 2 regions have created conventions, like the Istanbul Convention on the ending all forms of violence against women has been created. And we've been hearing a lot of talk about the Istanbul Convention because Turkey has decided to pull out of that. And we'll see if women put pressure on the officials to not pull out. There is one for the Organization of American States, but the United States has not signed on to that particular convention for the OAS, of which the US is a member. And finally, the United Nations has been creating and scheduling and convening world conferences on women. And the first was in 1975, second in 1980 in Copenhagen, 1985 in Nairobi, and finally in 1995 in Beijing. Next slide. So in 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women was held in Beijing, and it was held in September of 1995. Now, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who was our First Lady, led the government delegation from the United States. And she was part of the delegation along with 6,999 government delegates. There were accredited NGOs, international civil servants, and media personnel. Now, what was fascinating to me is my colleague, Dr. D. Aker, and I both had press passes. She had a television program and I had a television program. So we both had our press passes, and that enabled us to attend the governmental program that was going on in Beijing. And that gave us an opportunity to go and hear Hillary Rodham Clinton present her famous speech in which she kept saying, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, which has carried on for 26 years now. Now, in addition to those 7,000 people, there were also 30,000 delegates from non-governmental organizations. With 30,000 people, and it was actually more than that, attending, the NGO forum was created in Waru, which is a community outside of Beijing. So we would be bused to the NGO forum every morning. Now, 18 of us from the San Diego United Nations Association were delegates to attend, and 5 of us actually did give presentations at the NGO forum in Waru. And D. Aker and I both did presentations there. I'm sure I talked about the importance of women being elected to public office, and I was explaining how we've created a training program so that all women can feel comfortable to run for public office. And so that was our big push. Okay, so next slide. Now, the government delegates were really working diligently on creating the Beijing Platform for Action. And this is the manual. This identifies 12 critical areas of concern and the actions that governments, non-governmental organizations, political parties, everybody, if everybody would just take this PFA, look at the actions, implement the actions, we would be totally equal in all aspects of life. So the 12 critical areas of concern, and they debated this issue. They really wanted only 10, but the women from Africa said, no, we want a special critical area for the girl child. We need to make sure all girls are in school, and we need to make sure all girls have equal opportunity. So it was added to the list of 10, along with the human rights of women. So these are the 12 critical areas of concern, and the book outlines what governments, what organizations should be doing to implement actions and promote women's equality. Now, here in the United States, President Bill Clinton created the Interagency Council on Women. And he said to all of the agencies, all of the departments in our federal government, to look at this book and determine what actions pertain to that particular agency or department. So our federal government was totally involved in implementing the actions in those 12 critical areas of concern. And the Interagency Council met every 2 months to do an update on what was going on in each of the agencies and the departments to make sure we signed on to the platform for action. We were one of 189 countries to sign on, and President Bill Clinton took it very seriously and insisted that we were going to implement those actions. Interestingly, when President George W. Bush was elected in 2000, one of the first things he did was to abolish the Interagency Council on Women. So we've had very little emphasis going toward the platform for action beginning in 2000. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so in 2020, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women. And it was to be a big year last March 2020. And we were going to talk about, well, what kind of progress have we made in those 12 critical areas of concern? So what I've compiled here is some of the statistics that relate back to 1995 and what kind of progress have we made 25 years later. So we can start out by looking at poverty. We've made progress in the area of reducing extreme poverty. It's now considered to be $1.90 for developing countries. Here in the US, it's closer to 24,000, less than that. Okay, so we have made some progress in poverty. It's still involving more than 10% of women throughout the world. Okay, in the area of education, considerable progress has been made. Most countries have ensured that all boys and girls attend at least 4 years of elementary school, and that has been achieved, except in war-impacted countries. So the push is still on. Here in the US, we of course have exceeded that, where all of our children do attend school. And we have made great progress in the area of women in college. And it's currently at just about 60% women attending college. In the area of health, the UN likes to promote maternal mortality rates as an indicator of how well women are receiving care. And there's been great progress in that area. Here in the US, we're at about 20 women who die during childbirth out of 100,000. New Zealand has one. Their maternal mortality rate is 1 out of 100,000. Isn't that amazing? Back in the 1920s, the head of our public health department here in San Diego touted San Diego as the center for childbirth here because we had the lowest imaginable rate of maternal mortality throughout the country. And so we were touted as being the center to have the safest childbirth experience in the country. Wow. Of course, we have to thank Dr. Charlotte Baker for that. Now, moving on to violence against women, which is the most pervasive human rights violation on earth. Violence against women exists in every single country, every single city probably also. So what are the stats? Well, we can see here that 137 women are killed every day throughout the world. I'm trying to find my notes here. And that actually boils down to just about 6 every hour. A woman is murdered primarily by an intimate partner or by a member of her family. So this is a huge, huge problem. And one that demands our attention. And of course, sexual harassment is very common in the workplace. I believe in some of the statistics I've seen, it's as much as 80% that happens in our workplaces in this country. Okay, so let's move on to armed conflicts. This is a devastating part of women's lives who are in a war zone, and it does increase violence against women. And of course, in our militaries here, our different branches of the military here in the United States, there are about 20,000 cases of sexual assault or sexual harassment every year. So that's a big issue that the Secretary of Defense is working on right now. Decision making. How much progress have we made in electing women to public office? Back in 1995, it was around 12% throughout the world. 25 years ago, 26 years ago, 12%. It's now at 25.5%. And here in the United States, during those 25 years, it went from 11% to 24.9% in 2021. Okay, so we've been working on institutional mechanisms, and this was discussed back in 2020 at the 25th anniversary. What had happened when the CSW did not meet? The General Assembly of the United Nations called a special session. It was the 23rd special session of the General Assembly to just look at what kind of progress have we made in promoting women's rights and the empowerment of women. So the 23rd special session was the session that created all of this information that I'm presenting on this particular slide. Now, human rights is involved in all aspects of these 12 critical areas of concern. Media, there's a big push to end all forms of objectification of women, and we're seeing considerable progress made in that area. And of course, the environment is a major, major issue now for all countries. And it's fortunate that we have the opportunity to really work on all issues related to the environment. And the United Nations is working hard in this area. And of course, the girl child is very much a part of all of the recommendations that came out of the 25th anniversary of the CSW. Next slide. Now, at that 23rd special session of the General Assembly, it was decided that we also have the Sustainable Development Goals that were established in 2015. Now, there were 17 of these SDGs, and all countries are invited to look at these 17 SDGs and look at what the targets are in each of those 17 categories, and then to implement those. So as you can see, the 5th SDG is gender equality. So here again, there's this big push to really promote women's equality and the empowerment of women. And included in that, of course, is to end all forms of violence against women and to ensure that women have opportunities in school, in the workplace, and to be elected to public office. So again, these same critical areas of concern are part of the SDGs. Now, what came out of that 23rd special session of the General Assembly is on the next slide. So on the next slide, Jean, we can see that the working group for the 23rd special session created 6 action clusters, and that includes the 12 critical areas of concern. Now, human rights and the girl child are not included, are not listed, but they're included in all 6 of the areas. And then what the working group did was to identify what SDGs pertain to that particular cluster. Like the very first one pertains to women and the economy. How do we ensure that women get equal pay? And so the critical area of concern, the actions pertaining to that are to be implemented again, along with the SDGs. So we now have a decade to work on the 12 critical areas of concern and the SDGs. So this is going to be our work. And the Secretary General of the United Nations says, come on, we've got to get going. We're going to now have the UN Decade of Actions. We want actions. And so this is what the big push will be. Okay, next slide, Jean. Okay, so let's look at what happened this year. CSW 65, the 65th anniversary of the Commission on the Status of Women. And as you can see in this slide, it was scheduled for March of this year. Next slide, please. And you can see here what the primary themes were for this year. And the primary issue was increasing women's leadership and decision-making roles. We want more women to represent us. And we also want to end all forms of violence against women. So those were the two priority themes, and all countries were asked to report on these two priority themes. Unfortunately, the United States has not been participating in CSW for the last 4 years, but this year we're back in business and we're back being a part of the United Nations and participating in CSW. So when we look at side events, those are events. 200 of those events were put on by members of the United Nations. And the United States was back listed as contributing to the side events. I can't tell you how happy I was to see that. So we had the ability to zoom in to as many as 200 of those side events put on by countries, agencies of the United Nations. In addition to that, there were parallel events, and those parallel events were put on by non-governmental organizations. And so the United Nations Association here in San Diego put on 2 parallel events. And those also were available on Zoom so that you could zoom in and participate in the parallel events. If you could do 700, lots of luck, or 200 of the events, side events that came out of the United Nations. Unfortunately, many of those sessions started at 8 o'clock Eastern time. And so it was a little bit awkward having to get up before 5 o'clock to watch it here. So it was an exciting, exciting time to really, again, be involved in the Commission on the Status of Women by attending either the side events and or the parallel event. Now, out of the CSW 65 came the agreed conclusions. Now, member states were involved in contributing. How can we address these 2 priority themes? How can we increase women in elected office? And how can we end all forms of violence against women? So the agreed conclusions, it's about a 26-page document, lists what can be done and what should be done. And let's set some deadlines for this also. So that's what came out of the 2-week program. And the agreed conclusions are now available. A final version has been prepared and is available through the United Nations or through UN Women. So we have an opportunity, and I've been reading the agreed conclusions ever since. What I thought was kind of fascinating was the issue of gender. And Saudi Arabia does not like the word gender, and they just are adamant that we just need to talk about men and women. Forget about this gender business and all the different variations on that. So there was some heated discussions about the use of the different aspects of gender and how to be sure that we're being inclusive. So this was part of the discussion at CSW 65. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if we look at the platform for action, it lists what all governments, non-governmental agencies, political parties, what have you, what actions they can take to really promote women getting involved in the political arena. And so I've listed some of the items listed in this book here that countries are encouraged to consider and possibly implement. Now, a lot of countries, in fact, 80 countries have created quotas. They want so many women to run for office and to be elected. I remember when I went to Iraq in 2004, and we met with Paul Bremer. He was heading up, the renovation of Iraq back in 2004 after our invasion of 2003. And we talked about a quota. Should there be a quota in the Iraqi constitution that they were creating? And those of us, there were 10 of us from the US at that meeting, and we said, how about 40%? Why don't we say that Iraq could have 40% women in its parliament? Well, Paul Bremer's chief of staff said, oh, no, we can't go that high. We might consider 25% because American women would be very upset to see Iraq having a quota of 40%. So they do have a quota of 25%, and they have reached that and more. So this is good. And Afghanistan also has a 25% quota. But I talked with a parliamentarian from Denmark a few years ago, and she said, well, we started with a quota of 25%. We achieved it within a year. So we were so thrilled, we increased it to 30%. And now it's up to 40% in Denmark. And that's what a lot of countries have incorporated. Okay, so that's one of the key issues is how do we deal with quotas? It would be very difficult in our country, seeing we're primarily a two-party system. But if we look at countries, and the next slide will show this, how have countries done as far as getting more women elected to office? So Jean, if you could put up the next slide. We can see here, and I don't understand why those numbers are out of line. We can see here the 30 countries that have reached at least 39% in their parliaments or congresses. And it's just fascinating to me to look at these 30 countries. All of these countries have more than 39% serving in their lower house, so, such as our House of Representatives. And you can see here, we in the House of Representatives are 27.2% women. And this is the most recent information available, which is from April of this year. But look at the countries that are just about at 50%, just about at parity. And if you look, you'll see there Mexico. How did that happen? That just seems phenomenal to me. And there are other countries like New Zealand. This is relatively new that they have such a high representation. But if you look at the names of these countries, those are all countries that seem to have very little conflict, no involvement in wars per se. So what does that tell you about the impact of women as far as bringing peace to the world? So the Nordic countries are very represented there. In fact, in an article I was just reading, the top 3 countries are New Zealand, Norway, and Finland. They're the ones that seem to be the most progressive as far as women leaders, as far as women being elected to public office. Next slide. Now, what's so fascinating to me is Mexico. 48 point, what was it, 2% represented in their, they're called deputies. It's just amazing. And the women of Mexico are insisting they want parity in everything. So not only are they to be elected to public office, but they're to be involved as far as in the workplace, achieving management level. And they have been very successful in getting women elected to that lower house in their parliament. Now, what I think is fascinating, the three leading contenders to be the governor of Baja California, the top three are these three people pictured here. Now, the first woman is a former Miss Universe. The gentleman, Mr. Rohn, is the former mayor of Tijuana. And then the woman on the right is the mayor of Mexicali. And I'm predicting that she's going to be the next governor of Baja California. So this is the next push that women are looking at in Mexico, to get women elected to the gubernatorial positions in that country. I am so fascinated with what these women have accomplished. And they've also accomplished this 3 of 3, that if a person has not been supportive as far as child support goes, has been charged with domestic violence or sexual violence, they're not allowed to run for office. So it's amazing to me what these women in Mexico have accomplished. Okay, next slide. So we're all going to have to watch that, and we're all going to have to try to figure out how we can emulate what's going on in Mexico. Okay, so let's look at, well, how are we doing as far as women becoming heads of state or heads of government? So we have a chancellor, we have quite a few prime ministers, and then several presidents. So you can see here, and if you look at what countries have a woman as their head, it again shows these are peaceful countries throughout the world. What does that tell us all? It tells us how important it is to have women elected to public office. As Lori said, I'm putting pressure on her. I would love to see her run for public office, and I'd love to see Kim run. And so I'll just become a pest. I've done that in the past, and we'll be pursuing to have more women run for public office. But look at this again. You can see the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Their maternal mortality, 1 per 100,000. I mean, it's just amazing what women can accomplish. And the prime ministers are all of countries that are peaceful. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to look at the other priority theme. We already know we absolutely must have more women elected to public office. If we want peace, equal pay, women's equality, we have to have more women elected. Let's move on to ending all forms of violence against women. Now, I mentioned that the Declaration of Violence The Declaration on Violence Against Women outlines exactly what is violence against women. And it's broken down into 3 categories in the Declaration. And as you can see in the family, it includes, so much horrible brutality within the family. And of course, it occurs in the community and it occurs at the national level. So we can just look at what goes on in the home: domestic violence, spousal rape, in the community, rape, sexual harassment, and nationally, what goes on as a weapon of war. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if we look at all forms of violence against women, and if we look at, the platform for action again, and it lists and lists and lists for pages upon pages of actions that can be implemented to end all forms of violence against women. So you can see that it covers everything from care. It covers everything from how to really help perpetrators also. How can we educate men to make them change their behaviors? And how can we implement in our schools actions to show boys and girls what is appropriate behavior? So it's all listed in the platform for action. And we now have campaigns like the Me Too campaign and Time's Up. And at the United Nations, the He for She campaign was started, asking men to step up and say, I'm a feminist and I'm really promoting women's rights. Major push. Of course, here in the United States, we're trying to get the Violence Against Women Act reauthorized. It's been sitting for more than a year in the US Senate. We must have that reauthorized so we can continue funding programs that really help women who are victims of violence. And of course, it always helps to make sure that the Equal Rights Amendment will indeed be added to our Constitution. And I think that will happen. I think it will happen. I think it will happen this year. So we're working on that. We're working on pay equity, of course, in this country also. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what is the situation of violence in the home? And, the articles report that 137 women are killed by an intimate partner every day globally. 137, almost 6 every hour. 1 in 3 women suffer sexual or physical violence in her lifetime. Now, that was published by the World Health Organization. Here in the US, 3 women are killed every day by an intimate partner or a member of the family. And President Joe Biden announced during his presentation that 50 women are murdered by a gun every month here in the United States. And I think this was his plea to say, we must do something about the use of guns and how can we end this? 50 women murdered every month by a gun. Here in San Diego, the numbers over the last 10 years have been pretty similar. It's about 17 to 18,000 incidents of domestic violence reported to law enforcement every year. And it's just something that we can't seem to get a handle on. And Summer Steffen, our district attorney, is working on the strangulation issue because that's a terrifying and potential death for so many women. So she's created a strangulation protocol that anybody arrested for trying to strangle and kill a person must be subjected to understanding how deadly strangulation is. And we certainly saw that with George Floyd and other people who have been strangled by law enforcement. Okay, the next slide. So included in the family issue is honor killings, and Pakistan leads the way, and about 100 girls and women are killed every day because of some form of honor killing. The woman portrayed here did a film, which I saw at the United Nations, A Girl in the River, The Price of Forgiveness. This girl had married her boyfriend, and the family did not want her to marry that man. And so they kidnapped her, shot her, and threw her in a river, and somehow she survived. And she was able to forgive her family and somehow survived that whole issue and forgave her family. And the numbers of honor killings are going down throughout those countries where it has been allowed. Next slide. Now, another important issue common to the family is forced or child marriage. The little girl on the right was married off at the age of 10, or shortly, well, right after she turned 10. The picture I saw of her at the United Nations, it showed her holding a doll, when she was supposed to be married. Here she is getting ready for her marriage, proposed by her father, and she's carrying a baby doll. And I thought, this is unbelievable. The picture on the left shows child brides, and this was published in the National Geographic journal. Anyway, the little girl on the right managed to get a divorce. She found a lawyer who would help her, and she did get a divorce. She's age 10. Now, her story has been written, a documentary has been made, and her father is collecting money from this story that has gone virtual and what have you. And it's unbelievable. She's now married and the mother of twin girls. And I think she's probably all of 16 or 17. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, and how do we end violence in our community? Now, if you look at the one picture on the right, you can't see me, but I'm up there. It's a light brigade, and we're publicizing the Me Too campaign. And we're on the bridge over I-5 going south, and people driving by. And we probably, we put this up for 5 nights. And I'm sure we had 90,000 people see that Me Too, promoting the Me Too campaign. People were honking their horns, flashing their lights. It was more fun. The Light Brigade promoting the Me Too campaign. Now, there are 81% women who are victims of sexual harassment in their lifetime, and 1 in 4 women college victims are victims of sexual assault or harassment on our college campuses. 1 in 4. Here in San Diego, we had a slight decrease in the number of incidents of rape reported last year. So there were only 900, I shouldn't say only, there were 967 incidents reported to law enforcement, and it was a decrease from 1,100 of the previous year. And the issue of trafficking, sex trafficking is an important issue here in San Diego. It's been predicted or estimated to be about 3,000 or more every year. And the online selling of girls and women is about 75% of the whole sex industry. And one of the organizations here in San Diego, the Bilateral Safety Corridor Coalition, has what's called ABOG, a bunch of guys, and they put on phony ads on the internet advertising girls. And then when men call up, they talk them out of it, and they provide them with information on how they can deal with not ever buying girls again. How can they stop buying girls? So that's what ABOG is up to. It started in Portland, I believe. And so here in San Diego, we have a bunch of guys trying to talk men out of trying to buy girls. Okay, so that's another violence against women issue. Okay, next slide. And so we have to end violence by nations. Here in the United States, we were very involved in creating the Resolution 1325, which insists that women have to be part of the peace process. And when Hillary Rodham Clinton was our Secretary of State, she wanted all cities in our country to be involved in creating a national action plan to ensure that women are peace negotiators. And she set up town hall meetings throughout the country. San Diego was one of the 10. So we participated in creating a national action plan to ensure that women will be involved in creating peace throughout the world. Okay, next slide. And so there are other resolutions related to women, peace, and security, the agenda that will help create peace throughout the world. And these are just some more of the resolutions that really look at how can we stop sexual violence in conflicts. That's a major issue. And how do we ensure that women are part of the peace process? So I think we're pretty much to the end of my comments. So let's look at the last slide. Now, the UN is really serious about this UN Decade of Actions. So this is what all of us throughout the world, all of our governments, all of our non-governmental organizations, all of our companies, corporations, everybody, we're all going to be working on these actions. So we need to empower women out of poverty. I know President Joe Biden is really pushing for universal childcare. Oh, we've been looking at that since 1972, when Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm created a comprehensive child development program. Unfortunately, President Nixon vetoed it. But now we're back on track. Okay, and we of course need to elect more women as our leaders. We need to empower more women in the workplace, work on pay equity. I think Iceland is ahead of everybody else. They're at 89.5 cents for every dollar a man makes. So they're leading the pack as far as getting pay equity. No other country has it pay parity. No other country. So Iceland is leading the way. We, of course, need to educate all girls. We need to end all forms of violence against women. We need to figure out how to end toxic masculinity. We certainly saw that January 6th. And we need to work on ending militarism, another outcome of that January 6th fiasco in Washington. And of course, we need to end war. So these are the actions that we'll all be taking for the rest of the decade. And so we have our marching orders to really work on these actions. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Straley to talk about CEDAW. What kind of progress are we making as far as implementing the articles in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women? Rosemary.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you, Lori, for asking me to speak briefly about what we're doing here in San Diego. Anne was mentioning how difficult it is. In fact, it's impossible to get the United States Congress to ratify a treaty of the United Nations. It takes 67 votes, 2/3 of the Senate. So we are conspicuous by being the only nation not to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, not to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, even though Senator Bob Dole wheeled his wheelchair down to the well of the Senate in 2012 and pleaded with his colleagues. We still could not get the US to agree that it could be part of the world community in working toward these goals. So CEDAW then has no chance of being ratified. CEDAW, all of these conventions that have arisen since that great achievement by League member Eleanor Roosevelt, who with her skills got the UN to adopt a magnificent document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Anne was telling us about. So all these conventions then, since then, have amplified the rights of particular populations. And CEDAW, standing for Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And that spells out the standards for all nations of the world to take actions to do this, to make women truly equal. So in 1995, when Anne was a delegate for the UNA, I was a delegate of the League of Women Voters to the NGO conference in Beijing. And we came back to the Bay Area understanding that there was no way our country was going to ratify CEDAW, so that we had to take action locally. Think globally, act locally. That's what we had to do. So San Francisco City and County in 1998 were the first US city and county to enact a CEDAW ordinance. San Francisco created an office in the city government and with a budget. So they, in their over 2 decades now, have achieved a great deal, and they really are the role model for cities around the US, including Los Angeles, which adopted its CEDAW ordinance in 2003. And Mayor Garcetti in the last couple of years really has invigorated that effort in LA. So an office and a budget are really critical about that. So that brings us to San Diego. We managed in San Diego in 1998, and Anne was probably a part of this. Chris Kehoe was the spark plug on the city council, who managed to get a unanimous vote in 1998 for a resolution adopting the principles of CEDAW. But a resolution doesn't do it, doesn't enact the legislation. So last year, when the League mobilized 4 dozen community organizations into a coalition to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment. This was agreed as the project for the Centennial Coalition to finally deal with this unfinished business, to get a CEDAW ordinance for San Diego. And Chris Kehoe was very helpful to us and trying very hard. She got Georgette Gomez on board. For the first time in history, we had 5 out of the 9 city council members as women, and all 5 sponsored the proclamation in August, recognizing the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. We, the League's working group on CEDAW drafted an ordinance, and we submitted that package in July of last year. Barbara Bree, a council member who's been a really activist feminist all her life, she carried that project for us. So the ordinance started through the legislative review process, but we really got hampered by the pandemic and all the effort that was required to address the problems resulting from COVID. So we ended the year without getting our CEDAW ordinance. But now, let's see, I've got a few more minutes. Now 2021 is the year, because the political atmosphere has totally changed. We have brand new progressive leadership at not only the city level, but the county level. So we're going to go forward on both fronts. Mayor Gloria has launched recruitment for the city's new Office of Race and Equity. And that's really critical because we need a home for CEDAW implementation. So that's it, race and equity. We're putting, women are going to represent the equity part of that. And in addition, he's created a Black advisory group, the first community advisory group. And so we'll be working to get a women's advisory group created also. In March, perhaps you saw that the city issued the made public the first pay equity study. So that's a critical part of this. Now, Lori, as president of the League, has a very good working relationship with Chair Nathan Fletcher, who is leading the Board of Supervisors now. And we have 2 strong women on the Board of Supervisors, Nora Vargas and Tara Lawson-Reamer. So the League is reactivating its CEDAW working group, and we will be trying to bring to fruition this year then the CEDAW ordinance for both the city of San Diego and the county of San Diego. So
thank you, Rosemary. And I just have to say a shout out to Rosemary. She has spearheaded this entire effort. You know, last year when our organization was trying to promote this idea, we had, as she mentioned, we had created a coalition of dozens of women-centric and voter-centric organizations in San Diego to pull together a year-long celebration of the League's 100th anniversary and the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We had this giant coalition that was on ready. We had organized events throughout the entire year. And of course, one of the major thrusts of of that particular coalition was, as Rosemary said, to promote and propel CDAO through our city council. And the pandemic just destroyed all of that. I mean, all of our plans of, all the presentations and community outreach and events that we had planned in coalition and communion with all these other organizations. It was really a disappointing year, to say the least. So I'm glad that Rosemary has agreed to continue in her role. Like I said, she pulled it together. She helped author the entire ordinance that we put forth before the city council last year on behalf of that entire coalition. She aligned the coalition members behind it. She got their signatures on it. She did yeoman's work on this. So, I mean, all gratitude to Rosemary for her work last year and pulling this together, and her continued work this year to continue to spearhead it. So it was a giant effort that's still coming together. So I just wanted to note that as well.
Thank you.
So
I do have a couple of questions.
Yeah, let's go into questions.
We'll start with Ann Barron, who's a member of the League's Criminal Justice Committee. She asks, what is the difference between pay equity and pay equality?
Good question. What's fascinating to me is that the United Nations seems to sort of step aside from the word equity. They love equality, and that's what you'll see mostly coming out of all of the documents from the United Nations. Concentrates more on equality than equity. So I think it depends upon the country. Here in the US, we seem to prefer pay equity. And so it's just a preference. Now, I don't know. I know someone has dedicated her life to identifying the difference, but I think it's decided upon by the individual. So I think maybe Ann Barron would probably know better than I how to determine the difference.
Let's ask Rosemary.
Yes, I just wanted to say that another word for equity is fairness. And that's why that term equity is being used.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question from Widad Tlate. She, by the way, is a fellow board member of mine on ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties. So she has asked, why hasn't the US ratified CDAO? Is it legally binding? And why are not children included on this?
Well, the major reason, and this dates back quite a bit, one of the articles in CDAO states that women have the right to reproductive health and services. And anytime a lot of people see the term services, a red flag goes up and they automatically assume it means abortion. So that's why there's been some resistance from some aspects of our society that just will not support CDAO because of that. Another issue in CDAO is related to pay equity or pay equality. And some people just really don't believe that women should have equal pay, and they definitely do not want it included in a convention. So that's another article that has been questioned by some individuals. So it's not a binding, well, it is a binding convention. It does assume superior status as far as our legislation goes, but binding, I'm not sure would be an appropriate term. And so I don't think, even though a country signs on to a convention, as far as it binding, I'm sure another country or various countries could bring a country to the, say, the Human Rights Council and complain about not adhering to a convention. So that would be about the extent of it. What I think is particularly interesting is that we did come very close to having CEDAW ratified in the US Senate, but Jesse Helms from North Carolina would not allow it to come before a vote. He put a held or a hold on a vote for the whole US Senate. So that was a real disappointment for those of us who are really pushing for the US to ratify it. For us,
Why were children not included?
well, I just don't know how. I'm just assuming that they are included without being spelled out, but I'll have to look through some of the articles.
Well, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is specifically focused on children.
We're running a little bit long today, so I want to just take one last question that's been in our queue for quite a while here. And it kind of goes back to and wraps us up in the conversation regarding women empowerment and women in politics. So I know both of you today, both of our panelists today are very passionate advocates for women in power, as is the League of Women Voters. So the last question is just about the fact that we only have 27% representation in our, houses of power at the national level. As Anne pointed out, other 40 other countries have higher representation of women in their legislatures and congresses. So can either one of you speak to that? Like, why is our number so low?
I think it's because so many women are terrified of jumping into the arena. And maybe Lori could even adhere to that. But I think there is this fear. I remember I was trying to coax some woman into running for office, and she said, I have kind of a shady past, and I'm afraid that maybe one or two of my old boyfriends would step forward, and I don't know if I could live through that. So I thought, whoa, that's a real deterrent then, if you have this fear of an old boyfriend stepping forward or an ex-husband. So
I mean, there is a level that is true, and there's a level of misogyny too. I mean, I think women necessarily have to look at things it's differently than women do. I mean, than men do, in terms of how much latitude they get in the press, how much latitude they get on social media for the way they look, the way they speak, whether or not they seem appropriate, versus men who can pretty much say or do anything in politics and are lauded for it and held up as, cowboys. I mean, that's a great thing for a man to be called. He's out there breaking barriers and being inappropriate, and that's considered, he's breaking the political correctness barrier. But a woman tries to do something like, say something like women's rights or human rights, and that gets bandied about and criticized for years. So I think there's something to that, and I think Rosemary has an addition to this as well.
Yes, just to close, maybe here in San Diego County, we've been very successful about electing women to office. In 2008, with the momentum from Hillary's campaign, we organized Run Women Run, with the purpose of identifying, encouraging, training, supporting, endorsing women for office. We've elected over 120 women, over a third of them women of color, because our county demographics are such that we wanted to make sure that women representing the whole county were elected. So that's encouraging news for us here in San Diego.
And also in San Diego, 8 of our 18 cities have women mayors. So
Right.
this is phenomenal too. And I
Right.
remember when I was president of the National Women's Political Caucus in the year 2002, every single one of my representatives was a woman, except for the president. So we had Senator Barbara Boxer, Senator Dianne Feinstein, Representative Lynn Shank, Susan Golding was our mayor. And Shirley Weber was head of the school board. So every single one of my representatives was a woman.
So we're better
And
off
we
than most other places in the country as far as women representative of our rights and interests in politics here in San Diego.
We must mention Tony Atkins,
Yes.
who
Yes.
was head of the state assembly and now is our state Senate president. She's just making a marvelous record for us.
Well, cheers to San Diego for all of our good work. Cheers to the organizations that help put women in power here. Special thanks to our panelists today, Dr. Rosemary Straley, Ann Hoiberg. And I'd like to invite you all to please fill out the survey that's linked in the chat here. We'd like to get your feedback on this presentation, and enjoy the rest of your weekend, and happy Mother's Day again to all the mothers out there. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.